All right. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet all of you. It's fascinating to see so many people right now in this webinar. So a huge welcome to Inago's exclusive panel discussion with accomplished experts from the editorial board of top-ranking international journals and publishers. I'm Dr. Anupama Kapadia, Editor-in-Chief at Inago Academy, and I'm excited to host the second session of our Ask the Editors-in-Chief webinar series. So all content used in this presentation is owned or licensed by Crimson Interactive Incorporated. Some content may have been blocked for confidentiality reasons. Unauthorized use for any part of the presentation is prohibited, and breach of this condition is liable for legal action. So this is just a general notice. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So all the audience members here, you can send us our questions using the questions tab in the control panel or via the chat box that you see on your screen. We've received many interesting questions via email from our registrants and participants, and our experts will try their best to address each one of them towards the end of the session. But if you have any questions during the session, please don't hesitate to ask your question via the tab or via the chat box. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I would just quickly like to introduce you all to our esteemed panelists. So today we have with us Mr. Duncan Nicholas, who is the current president of the European Association of Science Editors, and he's also the development editor for Elsevier's Reproductive Biomedicine online journal. He's worked extensively with Tate and Francis journals before this. Duncan, would you like to say a few things to our audience? You're on mute, Duncan. Yes, thank you so much.
Yes,
no problem.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to speak with everyone. Such a large number of participants today.
Yes.
Fantastic to see so many people. Yes, as Anupama said, I am the president of the European Association of Science Editors. And in my roles in the past, I have worked with many journal editors, editors-in-chief, and editorial board in helping them understand what they want to achieve from their journals. So as well as working with many authors to help them submit, I also work with the journal editors as well to help them decide how to understand what to achieve with their journals. So I hope this will be an interesting additional perspective to our other speakers today.
I'm sure it will be, Duncan. Thank you so much for that introduction. Our second expert is Dr. James Wicker, editor of the journal Research in Astronomy and Astrophysics, which is published by the National Astronomical Observatories with Chinese Academy of Sciences. He has a background in physics and statistics and has been contributing to astronomical research for more than 20 years. Welcome, James, to the webinar. Would you like to say a few points for the audience?
Yes, thank you for inviting me to join in this panel discussion. Just a bit about my background. I started working at National Astronomical Observatory, Chinese Academy of Sciences. Most people just call it NAOC in 2007, and I've been working there since then. But currently, I'm in my hometown in North Carolina, USA. 我也会说汉语，因为我住在北京那么长的时间，而我可以帮助。如果有什么人有翻译问题，我也可以帮助。OK， 谢谢。
Thank you so much, James. All right. Our third and final speaker is Professor Wei Kong. She's the chair and professor of Department of Physiology and Pathophysiology at the Peking University Health Science Center. Wei has served on the editorial board of several prestigious journals, including the American Journal of Physiology and Cell Physiology, Circulation Research, and Matrix Biology. Welcome, Professor Kong, and would you like to say a few words to our audience?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Very nice to meet you online. Thank you very much for giving me this wonderful opportunity for the panel discussion. Actually, I'm right now a professor, so I have a lot of experience in paper submission, rejection, revision, and also since I served as associate editor of American Journal of Physiology, Cell Physiology, so I guess I also would like to share some experience with this paper submission event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all three of you. And thank you everyone for joining the session today. So I don't think we should wait any longer, and let's begin the session. Next slide, please. Yes. So let's begin the session by helping all researchers eliminate the very first hurdle that they face when they submit their manuscripts, right? Which is the desk rejection. So not many researchers understand the importance of desk rejection, but it is actually a very critical screening stage, right? And the faster the researchers understand what they have to, the checklist basically that they have to avoid desk rejection, the higher chances they have to get their manuscript published. So let's discuss a few points around this subtopic, and I would welcome any insights or any points by the panelists so that our researchers can, take away some important points from this discussion. Next slide, please. All right. So the very first question that comes to mind is, could you let our researchers audience know some of the critical points based on which a manuscript is actually desk rejected? So we'll start with Duncan. Duncan, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the most important things to understand about desk rejection is that it is the most frequently rejected papers are rejected immediately without review, and the most common causes for desk rejection are failure to be within the aims and scope of the journal, submitting to journals that your paper is not perfectly relevant to. And also another reason for immediate rejections is failure to comply with instructions for authors of the journals. Now, smaller journals will be able to work with the authors and perhaps help them meet the instructions. And even larger journals will maybe offer you the chance to change the paper so that you do meet the instructions for authors. But the very competitive journals that receive tens of thousands of submissions every year, the editors have to work through all of these papers very quickly to be able to deal with all of them. So sometimes there is no invitation to resubmit if you don't meet the aims and scope or the instructions for authors. So I think the first most important thing about desk rejection is understanding that you can reduce the chances of being immediately rejected by very, very carefully and thoughtfully understanding what the journal aims to achieve, what its aims and scopes are, what kind of papers the editors will really be interested in accepting, and then kind of be honest with yourself about whether your paper does fit that criteria. It will save you time and disappointment for being rejected.
All right, that sounds interesting. So I, although because our panelists, James and Wei both are from physical sciences and life sciences respectively, I just wanted their quick views on desk rejection. If there are any trends that you have noted in your discipline or in your subject areas, so that researchers from your subject areas take note of these points, and some points may just help them. So Professor Kong, would you like to go first? So what are the trends that you have observed in from a desk rejection point of view, say from life sciences researchers? Why do their papers get desk rejected the most, according to you?
Yeah, of course. Since the life science are mostly based on some experiments, and so the quality of the paper is quite important. For example, if the figure is less prepared and less than blot, like of overexposed, or there's no control, and the English is poor. So I think that's a major point that would directly that's rejected. Yeah. So pay much more attention for the quality of this paper. Yeah.
Okay. All right. James?
Right. So at the journal where I work, the criteria we use for the initial examination of the incoming articles are, like Duncan mentioned, is it related to the scope of our journal? And when I read in several pages, I usually read the first 2 to 3 pages of the article. And if there are really, especially incomplete sentences, or I can't understand their sentences, I send a message to my colleague that the author should probably revise the English in the article before submitting. But I mean, if I can generally understand the content, even if the grammar and spelling are not exactly correct, I mean, I'll accept it. But really, incomplete sentences is the thing that it's sort of like the main rejection criterion. Where, yeah, in my situation.
All right. So interesting that there is a question that is very relevant to what we're discussing right now, a live question. So the audience member wants to know, what should we improve in a manuscript to avoid immediate rejection? Even sometimes the scope and aims fully match with the journal, and there is no problem with the scope and the aim, but still their paper has been desk rejected. So would it have to do with the, all of the points that Professor Kong and maybe James also mentioned in terms of manuscript quality, incomplete sentences? Did we leave out anything else that the researchers might want to know? So yeah, aims and scope fully match, but still they get desk rejected.
Well, in terms of aims and scope, there's often a secret hidden aim of the journal, which they don't, which is that the papers need to be very kind of competitive or have kind of or very progressive results.
Right.
So that is a major factor in particularly the high impact journals, which are very competitive and looking for those papers which really advance the field. Some journals are very clear, and that they do say they are only interested in papers which advance, really make some big additional knowledge, provide some new information.
Right.
Others don't say it, but that is an important element in choosing, especially for journals which are still printed in paper and have a limited amount of space. So that forces them to be more selective and have to choose between 2 articles. So still the research can be perfectly good, strong research, but not as glamorous as other people.
Yeah, that makes sense, isn't it? Like, no reader would want to read, if the paper is if the essence of the paper or the study is already published and is known, what the journal might be looking for is novelty and or a contradiction to the previous literature that has been published.
Yeah,
so
maybe. I mean, repeating results and reinforcing existing knowledge is still extremely important, and actually a very, very undervalued, I think, in research among those very competitive journals, because reinforcing our current knowledge of things is very valuable, especially in fields where replication can be questionable, or there are questions about the kind of volume number of papers that provide information on a single topic. So
yes,
it's still important to know that repeating research and adding to existing knowledge is important, and there will be a journal there for this work somewhere.
Yes. The important point is probably not to lose hope. If your study and if your research is complete, not plagiarized, has some novel element, has challenged findings or has reinforced findings. Sometimes even negative results are important, not just affirming results. Negative findings are equally important for the the research world to know. So yes, all right. So let's move on to the next question under this subtopic. Next slide, please. Yes. So now that we know, at least we have some idea of why desk rejection might occur, and possibly what are the things that the desk editors look out for when they reject the manuscript. What should authors actually do once they receive a decision from the journal that their manuscript has been desk rejected? What should one do? I think James will go with you first this time.
Right. So the journal where I work gives, generally gives authors the opportunity to resubmit in this circumstance. And like I mentioned earlier, in addition to what Duncan was saying, I would say that if I'm reading, I usually read 2 to 3 pages of the article to make a decision, if it should proceed to the review process. If I find an obvious error, which not necessarily related to language, but even interpretation of the meaning that I know it's not correct, I would bring this up. But we, at the journal where I work, we do give authors the opportunity to resubmit if they revise their paper or correct some error that one of the editorial staff finds. Right. So that's an option.
Okay. All right. Thanks, James. Professor Kong, would you like to add something to this?
Yes, actually there's 2 options. One is you resubmit to you submit to other similar journals with this kind of a similar scope. But the other thing is you revised according to some review suggestions, and then, or probably you have to do a lot of work and maybe spend more than like half a year or more or even longer, and then you can probably resubmit this back to this journal. Yeah, there's another option.
Okay, all right. I did not know that. So doesn't that happen?
Yeah. It does happen only if you have make a significant improvement compared to last submission. Yeah.
Okay, all right, fair enough. So we have an interesting question related to this. It could be controversial, I do not know, but it sounds fun. So the audience member wants to know, is there any academic politics in desk rejection, especially if the authors are not well known in the field yet? Duncan, would you like to take this one?
Well, there should not be.
Yes, that is the right answer. Yes. All right.
But there was just recently, this week, there was an article published which assessed reviewers' reactions to the status of authors, and their results said that the more famous and well-known an author, the more positive reviewers' comments on the paper would be, which we could guess that's why we have double-blind reviewing. But yeah, this is a very recent piece of research that says the status of an author can influence reviewers' comments. But politics should not influence a desk rejection, because hopefully you will receive at least an idea of the reason why the paper was rejected. But unfortunately, we all know it does happen. It is a problem in the world of journals. So I can't say that it doesn't exist, but it definitely should not happen.
Yes, it's not ideal, but thank you for being honest. I think it does happen too. In my experience of dealing with authors who have experienced desk rejection as well as peer review rejection, I think sometimes they don't receive substantial comments from the journal editors or the peer reviewers. It's probably just a line about maybe the manuscript needs to be better edited, but there is no comment about the science, there is no comment of improvement. So I think in those cases, the decision might be a little suspect, but I think these instances are also reducing. So I think the journals are putting more and more conscious efforts into not letting this affect their judgment, so which is good. But
I can also say, sort of reference to things James was saying as well about incomplete sentences as part of a desk rejection, to elaborate that on a way. I've known some editors, well, the more experienced editors and professors and PhD supervisors, they can tell the difference. There is a difference between piece of master's research, a thesis paper, and a journal article. There are some very distinct differences between these, and sometimes an editor will receive a paper and think that, and they can tell straight away, this looks like a master's paper. It won't be developed enough for the journal, and reject it straight away. So that's an example of where status or the experience of an author is sort of related to that immediate reaction, but it's more in how the article is written, and that's an experience of writing and a skill for authors to develop, researchers to develop as an author over time.
Yes, understood. All right. I think let's move on to the next question in this subset, because we have a couple of interesting audience questions. So we did discuss what can authors do, to overcome desk rejection and use the comments to improve the manuscript further. These include, providing complete sentences, legible sentences that can be read and understood by the editorial board, ensuring that the study is novel and complete. Their methods are reproducible, what Duncan said. Apart from this, right, during the desk rejection stage, is there something that is termed as minor or major revisions? That is what an audience member wants to know. I'll just read out the exact question. What necessarily constitutes a major revision versus a minor revision at the stage of desk rejection? For example, does an inappropriate image quality or a non-representative image constitute a major revision, provided there is no other comment on research quality or quantity as such? So who would like to take this question?
I think I can at least provide some guidance. So I've been reading the incoming articles for the journal where I work for several years, I believe at least 3 or 4. And image quality, I think, is not at least where I work, it's not a criterion, because if there's a problem with the image quality, we can ask the author to redo it in the future. I mean, really, understandability is the main criterion that I use and some of my colleagues use, that at least when we examine incoming articles and recommend them for review. But most of the articles, I mean, if there's a really obvious error, or like I mentioned before, especially incomplete sentences, and even we give the authors the opportunity, like I said, to resubmit if they would like to. The journal where I work, I guess, is quite patient and supportive of the authors, but like Duncan was mentioning, more competitive journals with tens of thousands of submissions potentially per year would of course have less patience. They would have probably higher standards. I'm not familiar with the issue of image quality myself. As far as just quickly, in terms of copyrights, I think that an author cannot reproduce an image or cannot use someone else's image without acknowledgement or some legal provision there. But as far as image quality, I don't know myself if that would be specifically a criterion for rejection.
Okay, all right. I think Professor Kong, you did mention something about images when you were talking about trends in life sciences papers and journals. Would you have something interesting to add on to this, in response to this audience member's question?
Yes, as long as I know, there are actually some software available online, free or be charged. Then you can check the duplicate of the figure. For example, sometimes just the students not intended to make any plagiarism, but it just unconsciously and carelessly. So you can use this. You can either check by yourself carefully, or use the software to double check. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for this. I'll take one more question from an audience member. They're also asking whether you recommend an external English language editor to create to correct or improve the language for non-native English authors. Does this reduce the the chances of desk rejection? Does it increase the chances of submission and publishing? So Duncan, I think, what do you think?
It does, like James was saying, the understandability, being able to, for the editor to understand and be able to read the paper, that's very important. So if you are not confident in your draft article, then it can be very beneficial to have it edited. It's completely, it's very common that people do that.
Yes.
And also it's increasingly common, not just for non-native English speakers, even English speaking people whose first language is English, send their papers for some editing help, because, like I mentioned in my last comment, writing is a skill, and researchers don't necessarily have the skill, especially when you're new and starting out, to be able to write. So reading journal articles for the way they are written, not so much the science, but for how the sentences are structured and the words that are used, is well, it's another use of your time. You probably don't have a huge amount of time, but you can spare the time reading to understand and learn how articles are written is very valuable.
Yes. So I think with my personal experience, I think researchers do need to focus on the science part first, because when they're doing their master's or their doctoral studies, that is what they're taught. I think research communication or science communication is also part of their curriculum, but it doesn't take up a lot of space, or it's not given that priority, because I mean, they have to first understand the basics of research. Science communication, I think, comes later to them. So I absolutely agree. I think for early career researchers, getting help in terms of language editing or proofreading may do wonders for their papers. They learn from the process, and then maybe they don't need that assistance, say after they publish 5 papers or so, or maybe less or maybe more. So thank you for that, Duncan. I think we should proceed to the next part of our session, which is the peer review process. So the next topic is also extremely important. It is the most critical process that constantly undergoes changes based on the latest developments in the publishing industry. All right, so let's continue with our discussion. So I want to know, or I want to tell our audience, what is the one thing that peer reviewers, when they see a manuscript, what do they want the authors to be aware of without fail, that is not compromising at all? So James, we'll start with you on this.
Yeah, I think in this case, it's the legal aspects that I touched on before, plagiarism and the issues of reproducing images. I believe even historical images may be subject to copyright, which journals and authors, etc., have to be very careful about potentially publishing, even if they have some authors writing an article that has to do with history, for example, from the 1950s or something. If they have some photograph, there may be potentially copyright issues involved. Right. So that's, as far as I know, that's the number one thing that many journals have to be aware of.
Okay, interesting. Professor Kong, what do you think? What is the one thing that the authors should definitely know and be aware of?
In terms of biomedical area, I think the most important thing for the reviewer is the novelty of this finding. So for this, for the authors, I think it's very important when you write introduction discussion, just focus on what is unknown and what is known. So you have to really bring out what is the most novel things you have reviewed. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Duncan? What do you
I
think?
would say also the reviewer will want to know, yeah, what can they learn from this? What's the benefit of the article going to be to the field? So in that way, I think again, like a skill of writing is for the paper to tell this story of like Professor Kong said, what are the introduction, what's the background to the research, why is the research question important to ask in the first place, what's the value of this paper going to be, and then the method will be absolutely flawless, perfectly sound, very meticulously conducted and explained very clearly. Then you get the results and the conclusions and discussion, which will answer the questions that were kind of posed at the start of the paper, but also leave the reviewer as well thinking like, ooh, maybe I could follow up on this research myself. This will be quite interesting. Or, maybe there's a collaboration here, which sometimes does happen from the peer review process. But yeah, they definitely want to know what are they going to learn from the paper, and how important will that learning experience be?
All right, that's interesting too. I just wanted to quickly ask, does the cover letter, or the authors are expected to submit a cover letter along with their manuscript. Does the cover letter serve its purpose in trying to, explain the novelty or the importance of the manuscript, or is there something else that the author should be doing? Because I mean, as they submit the research paper or the manuscript, it will just talk about the study. It will give you an abstract, it will give you the entire structure of the paper. It may not necessarily impress the editorial board with the extra factors that you just mentioned. So how should the authors communicate this, in your opinion?
I'm very old school. I'm quite a fan of cover letters, but I'll leave James to give more details.
Yeah.
I was just going to bring up the point that I have encountered several cases that the author used the cover letter to point out the novelty of the research. I mean, it may not necessarily make a difference in the final review process, but for example, I've encountered at least one, or I think at least two actually, cases where authors did submit cover letters and they clearly explained why they were resubmitting an article, or what the points were that why it is novel research, or what's the contribution to the field. And so I think it is, I think the original question was, does the cover letter make a difference in the final outcome? I think potentially yes. I mean, I think if the purpose is to demonstrate the novelty of the research, I think yes, the author should, or it's at least advantageous to them to point out the novelty of the research in the cover letter. And cover letters are usually not very long to begin with, right? Maybe 3 or 4 sentences. I mean, it's easy to add one sentence explaining the novelty of the research. So I think the answer there in general is yes. It is advantageous to the author to describe the novelty of the research in the cover letter.
All right. I hope the audience has taken note of this. Let's go to the next question under the peer review process. Next slide, please. All right. So, is there anything that the authors can do to improve their manuscript to quicken the peer review? So we've discussed about improving the language of the manuscript. We've discussed about the possibility of using language editors, proofreaders to help with the, with the overall formulating of the manuscript. Is there anything else that the authors can do to improve the manuscript to sort of facilitate the peer review process? Professor Kong, would you like to go first?
Improve the manuscript to quicken the peer review.
Yes.
Actually, I think usually every journal has their general rules. Like some journals probably take a month, and some journals, for example, Nature Cell, they probably take longer for the peer review. Yeah, but I guess for this high impact journal, the high quality paper, once you get the chance, then you probably have to wait. The other thing is before you submit, and you just make sure everything is perfect. Otherwise, you probably paper will be retained because you are like something important. And for example, you probably miss some authorship information or the like some permission from university or something like that. Yeah, just to make sure every details was there. Yeah, I have met some problem like my students forget to put the supplement figure, and then this was retained back quickly. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, okay. At this point, I would like to invite my colleague Una, who would like to address a few questions from the Chinese audience members that we have. Una, over to you.
Yes, hello, hi. So we have a question from China that during the submission, the journal changed the AE. The editor in charge of the submission is changed. And then this paper has been under revision for a few times, but after this paper has been assigned a new editor, and somehow this paper just got rejected directly. Is this something that you have seen before, or is this something abnormal?
Yes, that is something that I have seen before in other journals. Not that any I've worked on myself, but it does happen. And it's really not ideal. It can be through a lack of proper communication, either how the editorial system is set up, or it could be to do with maybe a change of the aims and scope with the new editors coming in, or it can just be a very kind of critical associate editor who, like in the example that we had of choosing the decisions, two revisions and a reject decision from the reviewers, the new editor may decide to reject on the basis of those kind of comments. They might not approve of anything that's too critical. The other reason could be the journal has a policy of only allowing, say, 2 revisions, and then a 3rd revision is just rejected. No more chances for revision. That happens at lots of journals. They only give so many revision opportunities.
One more question that we've got from the live audience is, well, they know that their paper is in the peer review stage, but what should they do if the journal does not update the status of the peer review after many months of submission? Because until then, they cannot do any secondary submissions, duplicate submissions, from an ethical point of view also, because the paper is still under consideration. So what should they do then? Professor Kong, we'll go with you first. What do you think an author should do?
One suggestion, one thing I would suggest is to write a paper, write a letter to the editor, associate editor, and just ask what is the process, just politely. Then I think because some papers, they probably handle many papers, right. So it takes time for the editors. Yeah. And sometimes even take a longer time to assign the paper to the reviewers. Usually we'll assign like more than 7, 8 reviewers and to get 3 feedback. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Kong. Duncan, would you like to add to this? Is there anything that can be done in this waiting period?
It's, well, for one, it may be completely normal for the journal to take that long for reviewing. So you can get a sense of that by looking at some of the articles on the journal website that publish the submitted date and the accepted date or the publication date. And if you look at a few articles from the journal, you might get an idea of how long their peer review process takes.
Okay.
So yeah, that's one thing. One thing to consider is that it could be a normal amount of time.
All right. So I think we've encountered these questions, in normal processing of our assignments also. What authors tend to do there is they generally move on, or they generally try to complete more than one research projects, so that they have simultaneous submissions of different manuscripts everywhere. So that's what they try to do. I think we lost James. Did we lose James?
Oh, maybe.
Yes, all right. So no problem. We will continue with the webinar. We'll wait for him to get back. Yes.
May I address a question from the Q&A while
Of course you can.
we're
Yes.
here, because it's still on rejection.
Yes.
So before we move on from rejection,
Sure.
because it's a very good question and it speaks to the aims and scope. So the question is to understand about the papers being rejected because of being of generic benefit to other countries or global countries, while similar papers with a similar scope are published by the journal. So one very important but small, subtle distinction between journals is to do with the geography and the international or regional scope of journals. So an international journal, the word international can mean two different things. One, it will accept papers from anywhere in the world with relevance to any country or any region in the world, like a free-for-all, and that's good. Well, that's one thing. The other meaning of international is that a paper must have a global application. It must be relevant on a global scale. So that's a subtle distinction. And equally, a regional journal, say like a European journal, that European could mean that they publish articles only from European countries or only with a relevance to Europe. So the distinction there is you could have a Chinese paper on geology and it could compare geological structures and the formation of them in Europe to China. So that has a relevance to Europe, even though the authors are in China. So the European journal with a European focus may still publish that article because it has a relevance to Europe. So
yes,
hopefully I explained that clearly, because it's quite a complex but very important reason for why some papers look exactly the same, but one is rejected for not being relevant and the other is accepted, even though they appear to cover the same thing.
Yes, I think that has to do with the scope of the journal in a sense, narrow scope versus a wide scope. They probably look at what their audience wants to read too, and how relevant it is to, like you said, the region, the locality of it. So yeah, I think that does answer the question of the audience number. Thank you so much, Duncan, for picking it up. Una, I believe you want to address a question in Chinese.
Yes, there is a question coming from China. So after submission, it's been submitted, but after a few months, no updates of the submission status. And I contact the editor. Editor says the reviewer just went missing. No response from reviewers after multiple contacts. Well, it eventually got published after almost 1 year. So is there anything authors can do at all to deal with this kind of really prolonged submission cycle?
Providing lists of reviewer names when you submit that are independent of the author with no conflicts of interest, that can be helpful. Like Professor Kong said, it's getting very hard to find enough reviewers at the moment. For the last few years, increasingly difficult. So giving lists of reviewer names can be helpful. Asking the editor to make a decision on the one review that they have, or the incomplete reviews that they have, in case the author can address any questions now, that can sometimes help. I know as an editorial manager, I always poked editors to ask them to make decisions with the one review if the time was taking too long, just to be able to get back to the author.
Let's help our audience understand and handle rejection and then decide the next steps. So next slide, please. How can authors explain the reason for not being able to perform further experiments or complete suggested rework? So this is some of the things that the panelists also mentioned that the reviewers might come back with as suggestions, but they would also give you just maybe 2 chances, right? 2 chances of revision and resubmission. So how do the authors overcome this challenge, and how can they explain this reason? So Duncan, what do you think?
The response letter that you submit alongside the revision,
that's a good point. Yes,
you have to structure it very clearly and refer to the changes in the text. So structuring this response and being as helpful as possible in explaining the changes you've made and how you've responded to the reviews, that's a good start for setting up the answer to this question.
Yes,
so that
absolutely.
So that the reviewers, when you come and say, I can't spend another 6 months doing field work because it's not feasible, there's no funds, there's no time, and the weather system has moved on. It's not possible. But no, and hopefully, because you've explained it clearly, logically, with supporting evidence, it should just be, okay, that's understandable, that's acceptable, it's within the scope of this paper. You can't cover absolutely everything within one paper. Like we've been saying, small increments, small additions of research are fine because they help build up all of those little extra questions reviewers have.
Yes.
So you can even say, I'll do it next time, but not this project.
Yes. I've actually seen such statements in papers where there's a statement, that says that future work is necessary for, further advancement of this research, or a larger sample size is necessary, and this is just a preliminary study. And I think that sort of invites the next round of funding, hopefully, for an extended period of research. So Professor Kong, have you encountered anything like this in your experience? And do you have any advice for our researchers and authors?
Yes, actually, my experience is try to overqualify the reviewer. Any questions review proposed to improve.
That's good advice.
Yeah, but of course, in some occasion, you just cannot address every point raised by the review. But I think except to explain why you cannot do it. I would suggest you better do something alternative, like even you cannot finish this experiment the review asked, but you can still try something else, maybe simple or take less time, but at least you tried, and you probably can provide some clue, then you can finish later. So at least you show your altitude.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's important. I think
Mhm.
our audience, they need to know that probably the response letter is like your second cover letter. It's a second chance to convince, the peer reviewers and the journal board that your paper deserves, a consideration for publishing. And then hope for the best, I think. Yeah, that's what we're all saying here. We'll move on to the next question. Um, so sometimes, journals do give this advice to authors, and they advise them to transfer a rejected article and try a sister journal or the journal from the same publisher. So, James, what do you think about this suggestion? Is this a wise suggestion? Is this something that the authors should follow? What do you think?
Right. So I believe this might be related to a previous question about um, if an article is stuck in the review process for a
Mhm.
long time, how does the author deal with that? In fact, I encountered this situation relatively commonly, that authors send me messages asking why is their article stuck in the review process. And in fact, when I ask my colleagues about this, often the reason is because it may be difficult to find a reviewer because it's an obscure field, or the members of the editorial board do not necessarily have expertise in that. So in fact, perhaps submitting the article to a different journal that is more specialized in that field may give
Yes.
the author more positive outcome. And I have, like I said, I've encountered this issue several times in the past, and the reason, I mean, I don't think that our journal specifically recommends other journals, but
Uh-huh.
in our field, there are, for example, if a researcher is doing research in astrobiology, I mean, that's a really pretty, I don't want to say it's an obscure field, but not many people work on it. But there is, in fact, an entire journal dedicated to astrobiology. So
Right.
the author would probably get a faster reply if they submitted their journal to that specific journal.
All right. Thank you, James. I have an interesting question from a Chinese researcher. It's written in English. So, Una, would you want me to read it out, or would you like to address it?
I think you can just directly, yeah.
Okay, all right. So, this audience member wants to know, how would European editors view research phenomenon happening in China, which may be quite a unique situation and different from what happens in other regions? Do they feel it is irrelevant to European development and hence prefer to reject it? Or do they think otherwise? Do they think it is quite interesting and it deserves, at least passing the peer review process or something like that? So that is what the audience member wants to know. Duncan, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, sure. So this speaks to being able to communicate the value and relevance of your research.
Absolutely.
So if the introduction of the paper and the purpose of the research is to compare and contrast phenomena across the world, and the way the paper is written explains that, and that is an important feature of the article all the way through, and you can explain in the introduction and the discussion how this is relevant to Europe, then if that is within the aims and scope of a journal to publish globally relevant articles, then people will find it interesting. If something is happening in China and you can explain why that's relevant to other areas. That's true of research from anywhere in the world, like even America. For example, the American school system is very different to the British school system. So
Yes.
research on American schools is not really particularly of any relevance to UK people unless it's explained, and the information that makes that explanation valid is in the article itself.
Understood. All right. So Professor Kong and James, both of you have had extensive experience in Chinese research and working with Chinese researchers and scientists. Do you think cross-country or transatlantic collaboration with researchers in China and outside China, does that promote or does that facilitate publication of such research articles where the researchers are from both backgrounds, Chinese and non-Chinese? Would the response in this matter help the audience member understand this question? James, would you like to go first?
Okay, I have in fact encountered also this issue, exactly what you describe,
Okay.
a number of times in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Several Chinese authors have mentioned to me that Western journals, although they may be interested in the research,
Right.
they don't necessarily have the background to understand the projects like maybe Chinese journals do. So in fact, a researcher working on a telescope project in China told me exactly that if he submits an article to a European journal, the review process is generally longer because the reviewers and the editors there don't know necessarily a lot about his project compared with a Chinese reviewer and an editor. However, I don't want to make this sound like one part of the world is, against another part of the world. I think it just has to do it just has to do with the relative familiarity and the I mean the in that particular case, the European journals, they were willing to review this author's article, but it's just the review process took much longer because because they didn't necessarily have the background. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yes, of course, it's not, I mean, I totally agree. I don't think it's about one part of the world versus the other. It could very well happen, in an opposite direction, like it could happen vice versa, where you intend to publish something in a Chinese journals and, being a non-Chinese person yourself or an European person yourself. And so the question was more about collaboration, if that helps or does not help. Professor Kong, what do you think about this? What do you think about this point?
I think for the beginner, I think for the young principal investigators, and probably collaboration will help, especially to improve the quality of this research. But for the senior editor, I think once they have set up their is well established in this area, I think that doesn't make a big difference.
Right. Yeah. All right. That's honest enough. Yes. Thank you so much. All right. So let's move on to the next subtopic quickly. It's about retraction. So yes, I mean, now I think we're over to the publishing process. The paper has been published, but the problems don't stop there for the researchers. There is something called retraction. So we're all aware that the retraction rate is also rising, but what exactly is it? A lot of researchers are not even aware of a retraction process. Under what circumstances can their article be retracted? And what should they do if this happens? So moving on to the questions in retraction. This is a question that I'd like to discuss quickly. What happens if a reader reports fatal errors in an article that the authors cannot correct or explain in a corrigendum? So what generally happens in this scenario? Anybody encounter this in your experience? I think we can go with any one of you panelists.
Yeah, many
okay.
times.
Okay. So I'm just wondering what could be a fatal error, but okay, I think it means critical errors. Yeah.
This is where retractions come from.
Okay.
When there are fatal issues that undermine the integrity of the paper, that make the statistics unreliable, that make the conclusions that the authors are drawing from their data unreliable and flawed, because some part of the manuscript is fatally flawed. This is the reason why papers should be rejected on on the scientific grounds, excuse me, or one of them. So, for example, data manipulation. If the authors have been found to have made up some of their results, that's a pretty fatal error with the paper. Or they could be innocent as well. It could be not malicious, but there could be an inconsistency in the data, or some lines of data may be missing. So when the
Yes.
authors go back to review all of their data, they might find that, yeah, everything reported in the paper is wrong. So that would be a retraction.
All right,
I
understood.
think it's also important to reduce the negative stigma of retractions, because like in that example, sometimes retractions are necessary and not a bad thing, because
Right.
you as an author, everyone wants to be adding good quality knowledge to the world. So if an article has something wrong with it that presents poor quality knowledge, then they'll retract it. The probably a very good recent example of that is the Lancet I'm going to struggle to say the word.
What is it?
The COVID related paper from the
Right.
Lancet, hydroxychloroquine.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. Hydroxychloroquine. Okay.
Hydroxychloroquine, that's it. Yes,
Yes,
that
yes.
paper.
Yes.
The authors of that article did not know the data they were using was of poor quality. So
That's an
it was
excellent example. Yes.
yeah. So when these issues with the data were raised, the authors investigated and realized they couldn't address the problems because the problem was with the data that they were given. So that's a good example.
Yeah. So, Professor Kong, in your experience, is the journal able to sort of detect authors with more than one retraction? Do they blacklist authors? What is the process that is followed at journals for sort of screening these cases? Because there could be more authors who take advantage of it and maybe they come back, but say there is certain leakage. And what's your experience with repeat errors or repeat such errors that cause retraction?
I actually don't have any experience with rejection.
Okay. That's good. All right.
Oh yeah.
All right. Okay. So in terms of, okay, fine. If you do not have any personal experience, then do you recommend that journals do have screening process for repeat errors in terms of retraction? Because according to me, when early career researchers, when they try to find collaborators, they also need to know which researchers can they trust, right? Like in this case that Duncan mentioned, this group of researchers had no idea that the previous research was completely, we could call it falsified or, exaggerated. So how do authors come to know that, the previous research done is proper, not proper, because they're already published? For some reason, those papers were already published. So how do they come to know?
Well, I think most authors are probably working with primary data. So that's important not to manipulate your data in any way. That's
of course.
When you're working with other people, if you're working with data that's been provided to you for whatever reason, then I think you should be extra cautious. Have a data, a specialist examine the data before that you work on it to know if it looks inconsistent or not. But lots of retractions that are being brought up at the moment are historical.
Yes,
and they
are.
And they relate to sort of historical practices where it's still they still represent unethical research practices, but from previous times when things weren't so quite tightly regulated.
All right. An audience member has an interesting observation. He says authors write, so he's giving an example, I think, from his field of research. Authors write reduction and removal interchangeably without knowing the significance of both, because interchanging them is a fatal error. For example, chromium removal from a system and chromium reduction in oxidation state have a different meaning. I think that's where being able to communicate the science in the English language, that probably comes, to be of great help.
That's where corrigenda come in.
Yes.
When you want to make a correction to the paper that doesn't undermine the results, it just clarifies what is in the paper.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Let's move on to the next question. Yeah, so now we know when do journals retract articles. So from the handling point of view, because it's quite a major, so it could, some journals, they publish the retractions in the letter, right? The letter that they have, and some journals have blogs where they publish the list of retracted papers. Some of them also mention the author names, the researcher names, right? So it could be, somewhat demotivating, dejecting to be in such a public forum. How should authors handle it? Let's focus on the second part of the question, because we've already discussed the first part. James, would you like to say a few words on how should authors handle retraction?
Right. So I can only think of maybe one or two instances of the journal where I worked where we had to deal with something like this. I mean, that's over around 10 years, right? That we had an issue, and it was in fact related to copyright, like I mentioned before, that we had to retract an article due to copyright reasons, but we posted it on our discussion blog, and we gave the author multiple opportunities to, the author of the retracted article, to defend himself or try to make some kind of statement, because we tried to be as objective and as objective as possible. But this author, it had been 5 years since he published the article, and he didn't reply to any of our emails, so we didn't have a lot of choice there. I don't remember any other specific example of my journal taking, we do publish errata, okay? So errata is usually just a short statement saying, some author made some error. It's usually an interpretation, like Duncan mentioned, right? That is really important, that if there's some error or misuse of terminology. But that's one of the reasons I try to be as careful as possible when I'm looking at the language of an article, that is there some misinterpretation of the language. Right. So, but in fact, I personally don't have a lot of experience in journal in article retractions. So, right.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
The thing with retractions is mostly it is because of something undermining the integrity of the paper. So, like James said, it could be a legal issue. Someone somewhere along the line didn't get the right permissions or something, so that's so someone is kind of culpable. I think it's important to I don't know, it does depend on the type of misconduct that has been that has happened, that has resulted in the retraction. And if it's very deliberate and the authors have tried to sort of deceive everyone, it's difficult to suggest how they should handle it after it's been found out. They should just not do it in the first place. And that's
totally
really the issue.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for that. I think it's been an interesting discussion so far. I wish we could go on more, but I think we've already overstepped a little bit of our time there. I'm really sorry for that, panelists, but I think the audience enjoyed it a lot. So yeah, I think we need to conclude this webinar. But before we conclude, could each one of you please share one important tip for our audience? That is a mix of early career researchers, experienced authors, and budding reviewers also. Some of them are interested in becoming peer reviewers. So could you please share some tips that you would have? Professor Kong, could we go with you first?
Yes, I would suggest actually the most important thing is to ask interesting and important scientific questions. So try to make sure you prepare your manuscript in a logic flow of ideas and try to make the sentence simple and straightforward.
Thank you so much, Professor Kong. James, would you like to go next?
Yes, it's been a pleasure joining in your panel discussion, and I wish all the attendees the best of luck in the future. The main point I would give the audience members is use complete sentences. So a sentence is, I mean, I know it sounds simple, but that's the main thing that rejects, like I mentioned earlier at the desk rejection. That's the number one reason our journal rejects. So subject and verb in a sentence. If it doesn't have either a subject or a verb, it's very difficult to understand the sentence. Most other language issues we can deal with, but not complete sentences. It's usually kills the article.
All right, thank you so much, James. Duncan, would you have some advice?
Yeah, sure. First, thank you for all of the attendees for all of the questions and comments. They've been fantastic, and it's a shame we can't answer everything because there's still some really good questions coming in, which would be great to answer. But as a kind of final tip, I guess I'll reflect something that I mentioned earlier about reading articles to understand how they're written and break down the language of those and use them to inform your writing. It's always good for writers to read more, and that will help you understand. So I think that's one thing. And another thing is to try to that applies to all on the slide here: early career researchers, experienced authors, budding reviewers. And also I would say something that we've mentioned but didn't really have place in this workshop to discuss is about science communication and social media. See if you can follow communities and people on like WeChat forums and places where people are sharing and discussing research, and understand how people talk about it. And related to that, open peer review journals like F1000 Research, PeerJ, where you can see the first submission of the article, you can see the reviewer's comments, and then you can see the final version of the article. If you look at those journals, you will be able to see the development of articles, and you will see that final published papers are very rarely what they look like when they're submitted. And it will give you more confidence as well to see that, like, how imperfect all articles are when they're first submitted, and you'll be able to see the kinds of comments reviewers give people as well. So those open review journals, transparent review journals, are very useful for understanding the process.
Yes, totally agree, Duncan. Thank you so much for that. So thank you, Duncan, James, and Wei, for your valuable time and suggestions. We're all enlightened and have useful takeaways from this session.